Okay, so good evening. As I said in my email this morning, what I want to do is take a little bit a deeper dive into the oven of Akhnai story that we looked at last week, um, and because I again, as I said in my email, it's often truncated and you don't read the whole story. Um, But but before we look into the story, a couple of things. I did a little bit more research on Rabbi Eliezer. Sue, last week you asked me like when he lived, and I didn't know, and I'm actually kind of embarrassed that I didn't know because I should have been able to figure it out from what I knew. But here's what we know. I mean, and it's quite explicit in the text. He was a disciple of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, and he was the teacher of Rabbi Akiva. Okay, so that dates him quite precisely because Yochanan ben Zakkai left Jerusalem for Yavna in 70 CE. And Rabbi Akiva was killed in the Bar Kokhba rebellion, which is 135 CE. Okay, so it doesn't, I mean, so we know he was a contemporary of both of those. Okay, so presumably, I don't know how old he was in 70, and presumably he died before 135, but that's the time that he lived. Also, what do we know about him? Okay, so if you remember a few weeks ago, we looked at this Mishnah where it said Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai had 5 disciples and he described them. So the ones who are the protagonists in this story are Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Joshua. About Rabbi Joshua, he simply says, "Blessed is the woman," or "Happy is the woman who gave birth to you." Okay, and Rabbi Eliezer, he says he's a plastered cistern that doesn't lose a drop. Okay, and so what that means is like, you know, he's like a sponge. Everything that he learns, he retains. Okay. And so a couple of things about Rabbi Eliezer. Um, and the first, I think, again, will shed light on this whole story. Rabbi Eliezer was known for being not the most pleasant person. Okay. He was kind of harsh and dismissive at times, and his jurisprudential approach was quite conservative, um, and tended towards biblical literalism rather than the way the rabbis subsequently interpreted the text. Okay, which makes sense because one of the things that this text is often used, right, is an argument for almost unlimited freedom of interpretation, right? And Rabbi Eliezer says, no, you got to stick more towards the plain meaning of the biblical text. It really has to be an interpretation and not simply a pretense. Um, the other thing is that Rabbi Eliezer was suspected of being um, a Nazarene, meaning a Jewish Christian, okay? Because the Christianity in this time period is not yet a distinct religion from Judaism. The Romans considered it a Jewish text, Jewish sect, rather. Many Jews considered it a heretical Jewish sect. And most Christian, I mean, you can't even say Christians, they were Jesus followers, also consider themselves to be Jews. Okay. And at one point, Rabbi Eliezer was actually arrested by the Romans and charged with being a Christian. Okay, because the Romans were persecuting the Christians in Eretz Israel at that time. Um, he was charged with being a Christian. He didn't want to, like, obviously plead guilty to being a Christian, but he also didn't want to say that he wasn't guilty, because apparently, like, if you were arrested by the Romans and said you weren't guilty, the Romans got mad at you anyway because you're accusing them of, like, arresting people on false pretenses, right? Um, so he didn't know what to do. So when he was brought into court and asked whether he was in fact a Jewish Christian or not, he said, um, I have full faith in the judge. Okay. And so the judge, being susceptible to flattery, released him. Okay. What he had in mind when he said, I have full faith in the judge, was that judge. Okay. But very clever. But then afterwards, and this is all in Talmud, he said that the reason this misfortune befell him was because he had encountered somebody he knew who was a Jewish Christian, and that person told him a teaching of Jesus, and Rabbi Eliezer approved of that teaching. Okay, and therefore this misfortune befell him as punishment for approving of a teaching of Jesus. Okay, so you can see why he was, suspected of, if not, I mean, by the rabbis, if not being himself a Jewish Christian, friendlier to the Christians than was really proper for a member of the academy. Okay, so that's some of the background on Rabbi Eliezer. And now, and I mean, originally I decided to teach this text last week because we were looking at sayings of Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Joshua, and I said, "Oh, right, these are the two protagonists of this story." But as I, like, jumped into it more, I really don't think it's so much of a digression, because one of the debates is, what exactly is Pirkei Avot trying to do? And why is it in the Mishnah, right? Because the Mishnah is a legal text. It's a legal text. If you read any other tractate of the Mishnah, it's simply laws, laws, laws. So why do we have this text? And one of the suggestions is, this is really sort of the philosophical underpinning of everything else. And if that's the case, then this story, I think, really is worth a digression of a class or two. So let me share the text. All right, so I'm going to reread what we did last week, but I'm going to zip through because we already studied it. Okay, So this is known as the oven of Akhnai. This is a different translation than we used last week. So why is it called the oven of Akhnai? The rabbis surrounded it with statements like a snake. Okay, I don't know. It doesn't really matter because this really isn't about the oven of Akhnai. It's really about the debate. But the majority of the rabbis said that this oven could contract ritual impurity. Okay, but Rabbi Eliezer felt that it could not contract ritual impurity. So on that day, Rabbi Eliezer answered all possible answers in the world to support his opinion, but they did not accept his explanations from him. Okay. And then Rabbi Eliezer said, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, this character will prove it, so on and so forth. So this article that I read earlier today pointed out, I mean, the Mishnah simply says he gave all the reasons why his position is correct, and they didn't accept his arguments. But what didn't they do? Right? Which you don't even notice until it's pointed out, right? That's not the way the Talmud works. It's not simply, well, he gave his arguments and they rejected it. What are they supposed to do? They're supposed to offer counter arguments. And they don't offer counter arguments. They simply dismiss his position. Okay? And when you think about that, and when you realize that, maybe Rabbi Eliezer's next series of actions is a little bit more sympathetic, right? Because they're essentially refusing to play the game by the rules of the game. They're just rejecting his perspective, but they're not offering any counter arguments to it. Okay, so he says, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, the carob tree will prove it, and the carob tree uprooted 100 cubits. And then they said, we don't bring proof from carob trees, right? And then he said, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, the stream will prove it, and the stream turned backwards and began flowing in the other direction. And they said to him, one doesn't bring halachic proof from a stream. Okay, so again, this article pointed out that this is essentially an escalation, right? What's the difference between bringing proof from a carob tree uprooting and the stream reversing its course? All right, and I can't see hands, so if you have, just like jump in. All right, so the carob tree is a one-time thing, right? The carob tree was here, it uproots, now it's here, right? The stream is a continuous action, right? The stream is flowing in this direction, it reverses, now it's flowing in the other direction. But that's not just one time. It's a continual thing. So in a certain sense, if we accept that these are legitimately supernatural phenomena, then the stream reversing its flow is a stronger proof than the carob tree. Okay, so right then he says, let the walls of the Beit Midrash prove it. So they started falling And then Rabbi Joshua gets up and says, hey, walls, stay out of it, right? So the walls, they don't know what to do, right? So they don't want to fall over because they respect Rabbi Joshua, but they don't want to go back erect because they respect Rabbi Eliezer. Okay. And the article that I read points out that the Beit Midrash, the study house, the academy, is not just a place; it's a concept. Okay, and so you could read the walls of the academy starting to collapse as a metaphor, because who's really causing the collapse here? It's not just Eliezer, or maybe even primarily Eliezer, because the other rabbis who are simply rejecting his perspective without explaining their rejection or attempting to convince him of the validity of their perspective. It's just like sort of brute force as opposed to actual argumentation. Okay? So then Rabbi Eliezer says, right, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, heaven will prove it. A divine voice emerged from heaven and said, why are you differing with Rabbi Eliezer, as the halacha is in accordance with his opinion in every place? Okay, so you have this divine voice, and it's not simply saying Rabbi Eliezer is right in this case. It's saying Rabbi Eliezer is always right, always right. And nevertheless, they don't accept this, right? They don't accept this. And Rabbi Joshua gets up and he quotes, it's not in heaven. Doesn't mean it's not in heaven. And so Rabbi Yirmiyah, this is a later generation, it is not in heaven. Since the Torah was already given at Mount Sinai, we do not regard a divine voice, as you already wrote at Mount Sinai in the Torah after a majority to incline, right? In other words, again, as we said, and this is usually what this story is read to do, the interpretation of Torah, which is authoritative, is a purely human phenomenon, right? We don't, it's almost like a deist view of Torah, like God set the system in motion and then God's out of the picture, right? And years later, Rabbi Natan encountered Elijah, said to him, what did the Holy One, blessed be he, do at that time? And God said, he smiled and said, my children have triumphed over me. My children have triumphed over me, right? That God was pleased by the cleverness of specifically Rabbi Joshua's quoting him. In other words, he quoted God really against God, right? And that's where the story normally ends, particularly as read by non-Orthodox rabbis who want to claim, like, the maximal right to interpret, as a friend of mine who was both he was a lawyer. He didn't like practicing law, so he went to rabbinical school. And, he was in an argument with a classmate, and he got very angry, and he said, "You have no right to misinterpret the Torah contrary to the normative rabbinic misinterpretation of the Torah." Um, and so that's where we normally stop teaching the story. And again, I'll pause. I mean, we did this last week and then I rushed through it again, but if there's any comments or questions about what we've done so far. All right, great. So if not, we'll go on to Paul Harvey here now, the rest of the story, right? Okay. So the sages said, on that day they brought all the ritually pure items deemed pure by the ruling of Rabbi Eliezer and burned them in a fire, right? Everything that right? Because that's the argument, right? Rabbi Eliezer says this oven cannot contract ritual impurity. And the other rabbis say, oh, yes, it can. So everything that Rabbi Eliezer had declared to be not ritually impure, they burned it in a fire. Okay. And then they took a vote. And here the text says ostracized him. Okay. I've used the term excommunicated. It's the same thing. Okay. It's nidui. All right. Nidui or harem. So they put him in harem. Okay. And then they said, okay, so somebody's got to go and tell him. Who will go and inform him of his ostracism? And Rabbi Akiva, who was his beloved disciple, said, I will go, lest an unseemly person or an unqualified or an unfit, right? The Hebrew says, Adam she'eno hagun, right? A person who is not fit or not qualified, lest an unqualified, unseemly person go and inform him and would thereby destroy the entire world, right? If we send a person to inform him that he's been excommunicated and they don't do it in the right way, right? So the non-bolded part, this is a gloss or an explanation. This is an English translation of the Steinsaltz Hebrew commentary, right? He'll go and inform him in a callous and offensive manner, and that would destroy the entire world. Right. Now, before we go on, why would informing Rabbi Eliezer of his excommunication in an inappropriate way, why would that destroy the entire world? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
Rabbi, I've read ahead because I wasn't here last week.
Sure.
When you read ahead and in context, and I think this is an apocryphal story, but in context, here's a guy that made a carob tree jump around. He reversed the stream, and he allegedly had the voice of the Almighty talking to him. I mean, this fellow's got some power, and as we'll see later, he had even more power because it said that heaven might not hear a lot of things, but it hears the prayer of somebody in pain, and it's the strength. I'm having trouble kind of taking this on anything other than a story level, but it's interesting.
Yeah, but according to the story, right, he's like he's got tremendous power, right? He's got tremendous power. And so you got to be careful with this guy. Okay, so
Rabbi,
yeah.
I have a question. Do you think, considering what you said right in the beginning, that there could be any animosity toward him because of maybe him being a little more cordial to some of the early Jesus believers?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's entirely possible. I think it's entirely possible. And the fact that he's able to invoke all these miracles might even lend credence to that, right? I mean, in other words, right, if you look at the Exodus story, right? Obviously, that's a lot earlier, right? But there's no suggestion in the Bible that Pharaoh's magicians can't work magic. They can work magic, right? But it's not divine, right? So it's possible that they simply thought Eliezer was doing magic, right? Which is something that one should not do, and certainly by now, something one should not do. And therefore, maybe he got his power from the dark side of the force, so to speak, right? So, yeah, the fact that the Talmud preserves this legend, right? If they wanted to clear him of that suspicion, they wouldn't have included it at all, I think, right? So it's entirely possible that they did suspect him of being a proto-Christian and had some hostility towards him for that, although, it's just as likely, or perhaps even more likely, that they didn't like his jurisprudential philosophy. Okay. So what did Rabbi Akiva do? He wore black and he wrapped himself in black, right? Because that's what mourners did back then. And he sat before Rabbi Eliezer at a distance of 4 cubits, okay? Because halachically, if somebody has been excommunicated, put in harem, you're not allowed to go closer to him, more than 4 cubits closer to him. Okay, a cubit is from the elbow to the tip of the index finger. So it's like, I don't know, 1.5 feet, little less maybe. So, you're not allowed to go more than, let's say, 6 feet, right? And so Rabbi Eliezer says, like, Akiva is dressed in black and he won't come close to him more than 4 cubits, right? Akiva, what is different about today from other days, right? And Akiva said, my teacher, it appears to me that your colleagues are distancing themselves from you, right? And as Steinsaltz pointed out, it's actually the opposite. I mean, from their perspective, he had distanced Rabbi Eliezer from them, not them from him, right? And so Rabbi Eliezer rent his garments, right? He tore his garments, he removed his shoes, right? And he dropped from his seat and sat upon the ground, meaning what, right? When you tear your garment and take off your shoes and you sit on the ground, what are you doing?
Sitting Shiva, basically, in mourning.
You're sitting Shiva, right? So essentially, he's sitting Shiva in grief for his having been excommunicated. Maybe even he's sitting Shiva for himself in a way, right? But that's what he's doing. Okay. So his eyes filled with tears, and the entire world was afflicted, right? 1/3 of the olives were afflicted, they died, and 1/3 of the wheat, and 1/3 of the barley. And some say that dough kneaded in a woman's hand spoiled. And the sages taught there was great anger that day. Any place that Rabbi Eliezer fixed his gaze was burned, right? It's like the closing scene of the movie Carrie, if any of you have seen that, right? Right. But wherever he looks, catches on fire. Okay. So what the heck is going on here? Right. I mean, either he's just a magician or he's got tremendous spiritual power, right? But he doesn't control it well, right? Because he's allowing all of this destruction, right? And this is after Akiva said, you better let me do it, right? Because if an unfit person does it, it's really going to be a disaster, right? So this is
Rabbi,
what
however,
happens. What?
however, if you take this on the level of a metaphor of a story, but of a metaphor for what was going on, the fact that the other rabbis didn't follow the approved course, didn't discourse with him, and didn't give him a chance as they should of anyone else, that a curse befell the world or the
Right.
area, and that there were consequences because they didn't follow the approved course.
Right. I mean, we tend when we cut this story off at the end of paragraph 6, right? Rabbi Joshua is the hero and Rabbi Eliezer is the jerk, right? Which is the way we liberal Jews want to read it, right? But that's certainly not the only reading, and possibly not the correct reading. Okay. Now, so Rabban Gamliel, who's the head of the Sanhedrin, right, was traveling on a boat. Okay. And it says here, the head of the sages who were responsible for the decision to ostracize Rabbi Eliezer. Okay. Now it's true, right? It's true that he's the head of the academy, and the academy voted to excommunicate Rabbi Eliezer. But, the way it's phrased here, it's like he bears collective responsibility, but it wasn't really his fault. I mean, he was on a boat at the time, right? But Rabbi Eliezer believed, quite possibly correctly, that Rabban Gamliel was really behind this whole thing. Okay. And actually it makes sense, because then you ask yourself, well, wait a second, right? I mean, why did it when Rabbi Eliezer said this oven is pure and everybody else said, no, it's not, right? Why didn't they give their argumentation, right? They just simply rejected his position out of hand, and that's why he got so frustrated, right? And he says, if I can't convince them by the normal and proper route, I'm going to have to try another way, right? Well, who was it who decided that they weren't going to answer him, right? In a way that possibly sort of maneuvered him. Now, that doesn't mean he was right to do the way he did it, right? But maybe they knew his personality. And they knew that if they simply kept rejecting his arguments without argumentation, he would get frustrated and resort to this sort of extra judicial way of trying to prove his point. Okay, so he's on a boat, and a large wave comes and looks like it's going to drown him. All right, so he said, this can only be because of Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus. Okay, Steinzel says God punishes those who mistreat others, right? So is Rabban Gamliel acknowledging that, yeah, they mistreated Rabbi Eliezer, right? It seems that way, right? And certainly God is certainly on the side of Rabbi Eliezer. I mean, not only the divine voice, but now this tidal wave, right? So Rabban Gamliel stood on his feet and said, Master of the universe, you know that I didn't do this for my honor, nor for the honor of my father's house, but it was for your honor, God, so that disputes will not proliferate in Israel and the sea calm from its raging. In other words, yeah, right, I know that I acted improperly, but I really had to, right? Because if Rabbi Eliezer wasn't stopped, right, there would just be more and more and more dispute, disagreement, factionalism in Israel, and we can't have that. Okay,
You know,
which I
Rabbi,
think,
I think that Rabbi Gamiel went on Fox News and made that statement.
yeah, I mean, except that if anybody would be an appropriate candidate for being on Fox News, it's actually Rabbi Eliezer,
Yeah.
right? Because he's the one who has the Federalist Society perspective on the law, right? And I really mean that. I'm not being cynical when I say Federalist Society, right? In other words, he is an originalist, or he claims that he is, right? I mean, I don't believe that there really is such a thing as originalism, and you probably don't either, right? But that's what the originalists claim, right? And so Rabbi Eliezer, by hewing closely to the biblical text, right, is foreclosing interpretive freedom, right? The living constitution, as it were, um, right? But he's in the distinct minority, and so they want to isolate him, okay, fairly or unfairly, right? So, yeah, I mean, Rabban Gamliel doesn't come off so well here. And if Rabbi Joshua is, sort of Rabban Gamliel's stooge, he doesn't come off so well here either in this reading of it. Okay, now, Ima Shalom is the wife of Rabbi Eliezer and the sister of Rabban Gamliel. Okay, and I love her name, Ima Shalom. right? Mother peace, right? So this is a nasty situation, right? It's kind of right, where friends become dysfunctional family, right? She's the wife of Rabbi Eliezer, but the sister of Rabban Gamliel. Okay, so from that incident forward, she would not allow Rabbi Eliezer to lower his head. Okay, there's this prayer called Tachanun, all right, where to this day, when you say Tachanun, you fall on your face. You fall on your face, and it is the most sort of expressive, intimate prayer where you lay all your grievances before God. Okay? And she wouldn't let him pray Tachanun. Okay, and apparently, as we're going to see from the how this plays out, she like stood over him while he was davening to make sure that he wouldn't say Tachanun. Okay, however, there are certain days when we don't say Tachanun, right? And one of the days we don't say Tachanun on Rosh Chodesh, on the new month. Right now, sometimes the month is 29 days and sometimes it's 30 days, right? So if it's 29 days, day 30 is Rosh Chodesh. If the month is 30 days, then day 31 is Rosh Chodesh. So this day came and she thought that it was a 30-day month, but it was actually a 29-day month. Okay, so it's day 30, and she says, I don't have to stand over my husband and make sure that he doesn't say Tachanun, because it's Rosh Chodesh, and we don't say Tachanun on Rosh Chodesh. Okay, but she was off by a day, right? Because it was actually a 30-day month, right? So she was off by a day, and she should have been watching over him. But she wasn't, because she thought it was Rosh Chodesh when it wasn't, okay? But others say a pauper came to the door for alms, and she went to take bread out to him. In either case, whatever it was, she left her husband momentarily unsupervised, right? And if it's really because she went to give bread to a pauper, I mean, that's a good thing that she did, but nevertheless, a good thing with bad consequences, right? So she thinks he's not going to say Tachanun because it's Rosh Chodesh. She comes back and she found him and saw that he had lowered his head in prayer. Okay, meaning he was prostrating himself and saying Tachanun. She found him that way, and she said, "Get up, you killed my brother." And then the sound of the shofar emerged from the house of Rabban Gamliel to announce that Rabban Gamliel had died. So Rabbi Eliezer said, "How did you know that your brother would die?" She said, "This is the tradition that I received from my grandfather's house. All the gates of heaven are locked except for the gates of prayer for the victims of verbal mistreatment." Okay, and this is the real end of the story, right? That Rabban Gamliel essentially Rabbi Eliezer prays for Rabban Gamliel to die because he dies, right? Because all the gates of heaven are locked except for the gates of prayer for somebody who is the victim of verbal mistreatment. Okay, and that's the real end of the story. It's a fascinating story. I mean, it's dark. I mean, it's dark, and actually, I have trouble. I mean, I have trouble reading it. It's so dark, right? But it's an important story, and the scene, get up, you killed my brother, and then the shofar comes, and how did you, right? So, what do we make of this story?
Rabbi, I feel like this would be a good drama in Orthodox television somehow. But I have a question. Like a couple paragraphs back, when they were discussing it, they mentioned that they didn't want something to the effect of they didn't want any more like multiple views, like they didn't want any more contradictions or
Division.
divisions. So here again, not to harp on an old subject, but I understand that around the 1st century there were a lot of cults that were starting, even ones by Jewish people and besides the Christian cult. And I wondered if some of that filtered in here and they just wanted to kind of stifle anybody that was giving differing opinions of things and creating more division.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, look, Rabbi Akiva is an important figure too, okay? And Akiva, now, what I'm going to say is actually later, right? But Akiva was a supporter of Bar Kokhba, right? And actually, Akiva proclaimed Bar Kokhba to be the Messiah, right? He was obviously a false Messiah, right? So this idea of Jesus as a false Messiah from our perspective, right? Not unique to him. Right now, of course, Bar Kokhba is 100 years later, right? And Bar Kokhba is later than this story, but it's still Akiva, and maybe Akiva had some of these same tendencies as well, but also the idea that maybe Rabbi Eliezer was, in fact, certainly a little bit too sympathetic to Christianity and maybe even a Christian himself, right? So, yeah, at this point, the rabbis are consolidating their power, right? Because, look, there were more sects when the temple still stood, right? The temple's destroyed in 70 CE, right? And this is sometime later, right? So the Sadducees, but at the same time, now, and again, you ask these questions that like prompt me to think of other things that, actually fit into the puzzle, right? Because the sort of scholarly consensus had been that with the destruction of the temple, the Sadducees went out of business, right? But there's a group known as the Karaites who emerge in Babylonia many centuries later, okay? And the Karaites, again, said, we accept the Torah, we don't accept the rabbinic interpretations of the Torah, right? And actually, one of my professors, Ben-Sion Wacholder, demonstrated that a lot of the arguments that the Karaites made are in fact the same arguments that the Sadducees made, at least as recorded in the Talmud, right? So now, is that purely coincidental? Perhaps, or perhaps Sadduceanism went underground and reemerged many centuries later, right? But if that's the case, and we know Rabbi Eliezer's jurisprudential philosophy was quasi-Sadducean, quasi-Karaite, right? Which is a challenge to the whole basis of Rabbinic Judaism, right? That's why it's called Rabbinic Judaism, right? And the Mishnah is the foundational text of Rabbinic Judaism. And Pirkei Avot, which we're studying, is the philosophical underpinning of Rabbinic Judaism, right? And therefore, it was essential, perhaps, I don't know, perceived as essential to purge him from the academy, right? Because he represented a tendency that undermined the whole project of Rabbinic Judaism, right? Now, from my perspective as a rabbi, Rabbi Eliezer is wrong, okay? But you can be wrong, you still deserve due process, right? You can be wrong, you still deserve due process, right? Which is what I think most American Jews over the age of 30 would say about all of these people who are being arrested, right? Their views are horrendous. Nevertheless, they deserve due process, right? And so Rabbi Eliezer's views are dangerous and wrong, but the denial of due process for Rabbi Eliezer on the part of the rest of the rabbis is also dangerous and wrong, right? And maybe God actually agreed with Rabbi, right? But on the other hand, this text that hints at the fact that Rabbi Eliezer was right and the rabbis were wrong was preserved by who? The rabbis. It's in the Talmud, right? So, yeah, Alan.
Rabbi, the last part of what we read, Kehilat Shalom says that the tradition from her grandfather's house is that the gates of heaven are locked except for the prayer of someone who's been mistreated verbally. Is that a good translation?
Yeah,
because that is really interesting. The people that have been physically harmed, physically tortured, all sorts of other problems. But if, and you know, these days, if somebody really has been mistreated verbally over a long course of time or a course of time, I mean, that's how therapists make their money. That's how it's been shown how dangerous that is. But it's interesting that that's what they say heaven will accept.
right. But yeah, but I mean, look, the Jewish tradition is very, very strong on the power of words and not misusing words. Because the next thing, I mean, we're not going to read that because it's totally tangential here, but is about verbal oppression of the stranger, right? Now, Steinsaltz, the word is ger, okay? The word ger comes to mean convert, but in its original context, it means stranger or resident alien, right? And the importance of not mistreating, even verbally, resident aliens, right? And if we say, if it's important to not verbally mistreat resident aliens, all the more so not to mistreat them in more tangible ways, right? I mean, you know, text is always relevant. But yeah, it is a good translation. Ona abed varim means, you know, mistreating somebody by the use of words, right? Yeah.
Are there any historical parallels to this story? Did it happen again? Where someone was ostracized for dissenting from?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not aware, but you know, as it says, you know, I've never seen it is not proof. You know, I mean, look, if you study 2 pages of Talmud a day, you'll get through it in 7.5 years. Okay, so I don't know the whole corpus, right? So I am not aware of a parallel story, but that doesn't mean there aren't. Okay, I mean, because I know this story really because of the first part, right? Because the first part is the favorite Talmudic passage of every, particularly conservative rabbis, right? Because we believe that Judaism has law as opposed to Reform, who don't really believe in a system of law, right? We believe in a system of law, but we believe in the maximum interpretive freedom, right? So the you know, the first part of the text, especially when that's all you read, you know, it's a wonderful text for us, right? But when you read on, it becomes a little murkier, right? Which it should be. I mean, you know, murky texts are good. They're much more fun than, you know, texts that aren't murky. All right. Any more questions, comments? All right. If not, wow, 8:59. All right. Well, then good night, everybody, and Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you.
Rabbi,
Good
thank
night.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.